warned you.
Monty Python and the Holy Grail wasn't just a movie. It was chaos, coconuts, and comedy history in the making. Behind the laughs were wild problems, tiny budgets, and some of the funniest accidents ever caught on film. Today we're breaking down 20 insane facts, plus a bonus, that make this cult classic even better. Fact 1. A movie funded by rock and roll. Monty Python and the Holy Grail wasn't born from Hollywood magic, it was rescued by rock stars. When the Python crew first pitched their strange little medieval comedy, every major film studio turned them away. The verdict was brutal. Too weird, too British, too cheap-looking. Executives didn't see a hit. They saw nonsense with coconuts. Some didn't even make it past the first few pages of the script before rejecting it. So where do you go when movie studios slam every door in your face? The answer, apparently, is Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, and Genesis. These weren't corporate investments. They weren't slick producer deals. They were pure passion projects. Rock legends literally dipped into their tour profits to keep the Pythons alive. Pink Floyd allegedly used money from Dark Side of the Moon to help fund it. Led Zeppelin chipped in between stadium tours. Even Elton John's record label contributed. That's why Holy Grail exists at all. It wasn't funded by Hollywood. It was bankrolled by rock and roll rebellion. Without that cash from guitar gods, the mud, chainmail, and coconuts never would have seen the light of day. Fact 2. The coconut joke wasn't a joke. One of the funniest running gags in the film wasn't written as comedy. It was born out of desperation. In the earliest script drafts, Holy Grail featured knights on horseback, galloping across fields, charging into epic battles. It was supposed to be a medieval epic, not a low-budget farce. But then reality hit. Horses were wildly expensive. Renting them was out of the question. Training actors to ride them? Even worse. So the horses were cut. The budget couldn't handle them. That left a problem. How do you film knights without horses? The solution came from absurd practicality. Instead of horses, the knights clopped coconuts together, creating the sound of galloping hooves. It was cheap, it was weird, and somehow it worked. The brilliance of the gag is that it's treated seriously in the film. Characters debate coconut migration patterns as if they're real scientific issues. Audiences laugh because of the commitment. What started as a workaround became one of the most iconic jokes in British comedy. Ironically, if the film had actually afforded horses, the coconut bit would never have existed. Sometimes the best comedy is born from being broke. Fact 3. The original script traveled through time. Believe it or not, Monty Python and the Holy Grail wasn't originally just a medieval quest. In the earliest drafts, the story jumped through different time periods. The knights weren't only riding through castles and forests, they were going to stumble straight into 1970s London. Imagine King Arthur trotting through a parking lot, or Galahad storming into a modern office building in full chainmail. That was the original vision. The Pythons were known for absurd juxtapositions, and this script reflected that. It started as a medieval epic, then halfway through, the film would break into the present day. The Holy Quest would collide with traffic jams, bored office workers, and confused policemen. It was absurd even by Monty Python standards. But as drafts evolved, most of the modern-day stuff got cut. The film slowly became more focused on Arthur's medieval journey. Still, one trace of that original idea survived: the ending. Instead of concluding with a grand medieval battle, the film crashes into modern police cars and arrests. No payoff, no epic finale, just chaos. That bizarre, fourth wall-breaking finale was the last remnant of the time-traveling script. Too weird to keep, but somehow too perfect to throw away. Fact 4. Scotland was cold, wet, and miserable. The legend of Holy Grail is that it looks like a mud-soaked medieval epic. That wasn't just movie magic. Filming in Scotland was genuinely brutal. The crew faced rain, fog, and bitter cold on nearly every shoot. Day 1 was a disaster. The cameras jammed, the light disappeared, the costumes were soaked through, and the actors froze in their fake armor. On top of that, Graham Chapman, cast as King Arthur, was struggling with alcoholism. His nerves and illness made delivering lines difficult. Directors Terry Gilliam and Terry Jones were constantly shouting over one another with competing visions. By the end of the first day, producers seriously considered pulling the plug. The movie could have died before it even began. But the Pythons pushed forward. They reset, dried costumes as best they could, and shot scenes through mud and misery. The constant Scottish rain soaked the actors' fake chainmail until it became unbearably heavy. Crew members huddled under umbrellas that did nothing against the wind. It was chaos, but the suffering strangely made the final product better. That damp, uncomfortable atmosphere gave the film its authentic medieval grit. In the end, the cold became part of the comedy. Fact 5. Fake armor that hurt more than real armor. On screen, the Knights of Holy Grail look like they're wearing heavy chainmail. But in reality, the armor wasn't metal at all. The production couldn't afford proper costumes, so they improvised. Chainmail was created out of knitted wool, fishing gear, and even dish scrubbers, all coated in metallic paint. From a distance, it looked convincing. Up close? Not so much. There was a bigger problem: rain, and in Scotland, rain was constant. The wool armor soaked up water like a sponge, doubling in weight. Actors who started the morning in light costumes ended the day staggering around in heavy, freezing wet rags. By lunchtime, they could barely sit down. By nightfall, they were shivering uncontrollably. Some cast members recalled standing around, teeth chattering, with no way to dry their clothes between takes. Unlike real steel, which at least repels water, fake chainmail trapped it. The result was pure misery for the performers, who had to keep straight faces while wearing dripping, freezing armor. Ironically, the cheap costumes ended up adding to the authenticity. The knights looked uncomfortable because they were uncomfortable. That accidental realism gave the absurd comedy an oddly gritty medieval texture. Fact 6. Directors who couldn't stop fighting. Most films have one director. Monty Python and the Holy Grail had two: Terry Jones and Terry Gilliam. On paper, this sounded like a great idea. Both were Python members, both had vision, both loved absurd humor. But in practice, it was chaos. Gilliam, the group's animator, approached every scene with an obsessive eye for visuals. He wanted sweeping shots, gritty details, and painterly landscapes. Jones, on the other hand, focused on the performances and timing. He wanted to make sure the jokes landed, the pacing worked, and the actors felt free to experiment. The problem? They both wanted final say. On set, the cast often had to choose which Terry to listen to. Sometimes Gilliam would shout for a scene to be darker and more dramatic, while Jones would yell for it to be sillier and faster. The tension was so intense that, years later, they admitted they could barely stand working together. The constant battles slowed production, but in hindsight, that creative tug-of-war gave Holy Grail its unique tone. It wasn't just funny, it was cinematic. It looked epic, but never stopped being ridiculous. Two directors clashing somehow created comedy gold. Fact 7. Graham Chapman's secret struggle. Graham Chapman played King Arthur, the straight man at the center of all the madness. But what audiences didn't see was the very real struggle he faced behind the camera. By the mid-1970s, Chapman was battling alcoholism, and it hit hardest during filming. He often showed up on set shaky, sick, and sometimes unable to remember his lines. Cast members recalled that he'd forget entire monologues, forcing endless retakes. On horseback, or rather, when pretending to be on horseback, he sometimes lost his balance. Crew members worried for his safety more than once. Despite this, Chapman still managed to deliver one of the most iconic performances in British comedy. His deadpan delivery, his ability to play Arthur as serious amidst absurdity, that contrast made the film work. The Pythons later admitted that if Arthur had been goofy too, the movie would have collapsed. Behind the humor, Chapman's story is tragic. His alcoholism haunted him throughout his life. But on screen, he was unforgettable. King Arthur wasn't just a leader of knights, he was the anchor that made coconuts, mud, and killer rabbits feel hilariously real. Fact 8. Castles denied, castles borrowed. When people think of Holy Grail, they picture sweeping Scottish castles. But here's the truth. Almost no castle wanted Monty Python filming inside. The production applied to shoot at multiple historic sites across Scotland, but most flat out refused. Why? The Python's script was considered disrespectful to history and religion. In the end, they found one castle that said yes, Dune Castle, and then in true Python fashion, they turned one castle into many. Nearly every castle you see in the movie is actually Dune, shot from different angles, redressed or edited to look unique. Camelot, Dune. The French taunting scene, Dune. The Bridge of Death, just outside Dune. The filmmakers leaned into the limitation, joking about it later. In fact, Dune Castle became so tied to Holy Grail that today it's a pilgrimage spot for fans. Visitors can even take a Holy Grail tour, complete with coconut halves to clap together as they walk the grounds. So while the movie looks like it spans half of medieval Britain, most of it was filmed in and around one single castle. Cheap, practical, and hilariously Python. Fact 9. Mud is a special effect. Forget CGI. Forget fake Hollywood sets. Holy Grail used the real Scottish wilderness as its backdrop. But what the actors didn't expect was how brutal that would be. The film was shot in the middle of a wet Scottish spring, and that meant one thing: mud. Endless, sticky, freezing mud. The Pythons didn't have proper trailers or fancy costume departments. Once an actor's costume was covered in muck, that was it. They stayed that way. Extras playing peasants literally rolled around in it to look authentic. Terry Gilliam later joked that Scotland itself provided all the special effects the film could afford: rain, fog, mud, and misery. For the audience, the mud made the world look convincingly medieval. For the cast, it was torture. Clothes never dried, shoes fell apart, and everyone reeked. But in an odd way, it worked. The mud gave the comedy a weird realism. When King Arthur trudges through filth to declare his nobility, the contrast makes it twice as funny. The dirt, the grit, the grime. It wasn't stage. It was Scotland laughing along with Monty Python. Fact 10. The Killer Rabbit Disaster. The Killer Rabbit of Caerbannog is one of the funniest scenes in the film, a fluffy white bunny that suddenly becomes a bloodthirsty monster. But behind the camera, that rabbit was a nightmare. The crew borrowed a real white rabbit from a local animal handler, assuming they'd just splash fake blood on its fur for the effect. What they didn't realize was that fake blood doesn't wash off easily. After one take, the rabbit was permanently stained red. The owner was horrified, the crew panicked, and the pythons had to scramble. To make it worse, the rabbit wasn't trained because it was just an ordinary pet. It wouldn't attack on cue, it wouldn't move toward the actors. And most of the savage footage had to be created with camera tricks and clever editing. In the end, the rabbit became legendary, but filming the scene was chaos. Chapman even admitted he was genuinely nervous kneeling near it, not because it was dangerous, but because he knew if anything went wrong, they'd never hear the end of it from the furious owner. Fact 11. The not-so-fake injuries. The comedy in Holy Grail was supposed to be absurd and harmless, but the filming conditions were anything but safe. The low budget meant no stunt doubles, no proper padding, and almost no safety regulations. If someone fell, they fell for real. During fight scenes, swords were heavy, shields were clunky, and costumes were stiff. Actors often hit each other harder than intended. Michael Palin recalled multiple bruises from accidental blows. Terry Gilliam, who was directing, would sometimes yell, "Do it again, but make it look real," even if that meant someone actually getting knocked over in the mud. The most notorious example was the scene with the Black Knight, where limbs are hacked off. The practical effects were crude, and the actors inside the armor nearly suffocated from the heat and lack of air. Between takes, they had to be dragged out of costume just to breathe. The audience laughed at the blood sprays and silly violence, but for the cast, those gags came with real cuts, bruises, and exhaustion. Comedy may look easy, but Holy Grail demanded real pain for laughs. Fact 12. Scotland almost kicked them out. Monty Python chose Scotland for its castles, mountains, and misty medieval vibe, but filming there was anything but smooth. The crew had little money to spend, and the locals weren't always thrilled about a ragtag comedy troupe tearing up their countryside. At one point, landowners actually tried to shut down production, claiming the pythons were damaging the grounds. Castles were especially tricky. The group had originally hoped to use multiple castles to portray different locations in the film, but many turned them away. Eventually, they had to shoot almost every castle scene at Doune Castle and just use clever angles to make it look like different places. The Scottish weather didn't help either. Rain poured down unpredictably, drenching costumes and ruining takes. It was so miserable that crew members joked the real villain of Holy Grail wasn't the Black Knight or the Killer Rabbit, it was Scotland itself. Still, the landscapes gave the film its iconic look. Without Scotland's mist, stone, and boggy swamps, the movie wouldn't have had its authentic medieval charm. Fact 13. The infamous castle anthrax scene. One of the film's most notorious moments is the castle anthrax scene, where Sir Galahad stumbles into a castle full of young women. It's played as ridiculous, over-the-top temptation, but filming it was deeply awkward for the cast. The actresses cast as the maidens weren't used to Monty Python's chaotic style, and the scene took much longer to shoot than expected. Michael Palin, who played Galahad, later admitted he was embarrassed through most of it, especially since his wife visited the set that day. To make matters more uncomfortable, the Pythons argued over how far to push the joke. Some thought it should be more risque, others thought it should stay silly and innocent. In the end, they settled on absurd dialogue and awkward tension, rather than anything explicit. The result is one of the funniest sequences in the movie, where Galahad is rescued against his will. But behind the comedy, it was one of the hardest scenes to shoot without the cast-breaking character or the extras rolling their eyes at the nonsense. Fact 14. The famous ending was a budget hack. The ending of Monty Python and the Holy Grail is one of the strangest in film history. Just as Arthur and his knights prepare for an epic final battle, police suddenly storm in and shut everything down. No resolution, no grand finale, just a hard cut to black. Fans still debate it. Was it genius, lazy, surreal brilliance? In reality, it was mostly about money. The Pythons had originally planned a massive castle siege with hundreds of extras, catapults, and explosions, but they simply couldn't afford it. Faced with the problem of how to end the movie, they came up with the most Python-esque solution possible. Don't end it at all. Have the police show up, break the illusion, and roll credits. It cost almost nothing to film and turned into one of the most talked about finales in comedy history. What started as a budget-saving measure ended up being one of the most iconic examples of Monty Python's absurdist humor. Fact 15. The sound effects were homemade. One of the funniest running gags in the movie is King Arthur's horses being replaced by coconuts. The idea came from necessity. The budget couldn't cover real horses. But the coconuts weren't just a visual joke. They became a full-on sound effect. Instead of hiring a professional sound department, the crew made most of the effects themselves. The clopping of coconut shells was literally recorded by Python members banging them together in rhythm. Some of the battle noises, screams, and even squishy blood sounds were created with household items. This DIY approach gave the film its scrappy handmade feel. What could have been a weakness, the lack of resources, was turned into one of its most iconic comedic tools. To this day, people still mimic the coconut horse as shorthand for Monty Python. Fact 16. Eric Idle almost quit over the costumes. The costumes in Holy Grail looked convincingly medieval, but they were torture for the cast. Heavy chainmail was far too expensive, so the wardrobe team made fake versions out of knitted wool, spray-painted silver. The problem? When it rained, and it rained a lot in Scotland, the wool absorbed water like a sponge. The actors ended up carrying around soaking wet costumes that weighed a ton. Eric Idle complained that it was like wearing a medieval cement block on his shoulders. Between takes, the cast would strip off their dripping outfits just to breathe, only to put them back on again for the next scene. Idle later joked that the Pythons suffered for their art, but mostly just suffered. The misery, though, paid off, because those costumes still look gritty and authentic on screen, even if they nearly drowned the actors wearing them. Fact 17. The budget ran out mid-shoot. The entire film was made for around £229,000, a laughably small sum, even in the 1970s. As production dragged on, the money started vanishing faster than expected. Halfway through filming, the crew realized they were dangerously close to running out of cash. Instead of shutting down, they cut corners at every opportunity. Extras were reduced, props were recycled, and the same castle was filmed from multiple angles to look like different locations. Some scenes were shortened or scrapped entirely. The budget problems even influenced the script. Whole sequences that required big set pieces were abandoned, replaced by smaller dialogue-driven gags. That's part of why Holy Grail feels so surreal. Its strange pacing and abrupt shifts were born out of necessity. Ironically, the lack of money forced Monty Python to be even more creative. What should have been a limitation became part of the movie's bizarre genius. Fact 18. The Swamp Castle gag was based on real life. One of the funniest bits in the movie is the tale of the Swamp Castle, where a stubborn lord brags about building a castle on a swamp, even though each one keeps sinking. It's classic Monty Python, absurd repetition taken to the extreme. But the inspiration came from something real. While researching medieval history, the Pythons learned that many castles in Britain were built in terrible locations, on marshy ground, unstable soil, or floodplains. Some really did collapse or sink shortly after construction. The group took that dry fact and cranked it up into a ridiculous gag. By the time the Lord declares, "The fourth one stayed up," it's pure comedy gold. It's a perfect example of Monty Python's style, taking history, exaggerating it, and turning it into a running joke that sticks in your head forever. Fact 19. The killer rabbit was deadly in real life. Sort of. The killer rabbit of Caerbannog is one of the most famous scenes in the movie. A cute little bunny suddenly becomes a bloodthirsty monster, taking out knights left and right. On screen, it looks hilarious. Off screen, though, it was chaos. The rabbit was actually someone's pet, dyed with fake blood for the shoot. The crew quickly discovered that animals don't exactly take stage directions. The rabbit refused to attack on cue, so the editors had to rely on quick cuts and exaggerated reactions to sell the joke. Worse, the fake blood wouldn't wash out. The poor rabbit went home still stained pinkish red, which reportedly horrified its owners. Despite the headaches, the gag worked better than anyone expected. To this day, the killer rabbit remains one of Monty Python's most quoted and merchandised creations. Fact 20. Test screenings were a disaster. When the first rough cut of Monty Python and the Holy Grail was shown to test audiences, it bombed. Many viewers didn't laugh at all. The pacing felt strange, the humor too weird, and the abrupt ending left people confused. The Pythons were crushed, thinking they had made a flop. But instead of giving up, they re-edited the movie, trimming down slower scenes and tightening the rhythm of the jokes. The changes made all the difference. By the time the final cut was released, audiences were roaring with laughter. The same film that seemed like a failure suddenly became a comedy classic. It's a reminder that even genius can look like nonsense until it's shaped in the editing room. And there you have it, Monty Python and the Holy Grail, a film so cheap, weird, and brilliant, it's still making us laugh decades later. Which scene is your favorite? The Black Knight, the killer rabbit, or just the coconuts? Let us know in the comments, and remember, it's only a flesh wound.